Test, test, test. Good? All right, JP, I'll look for the thumbs up. Okay, great. All right, welcome to the 8th community meeting for the GSA. We took a little bit of a hiatus. The last time we met was in May of this year, so thanks for coming back. This will be the final community meeting. We're covering the last topics, which are management action, projects management actions. We're looping back a little bit to some work that we had to do in the basin setting in the context of projects and management actions, and I won't get into the detail of that. You'll hear about it. I'm sorry, I always forget to introduce myself. I'm Bob McDonald. I'm the Executive Director for the Groundwater Sustainability Agency. If you would, there's a sign-up sheet on the table. If you could do us a favor of putting down your name there. There's also information there if you're interested, printed information. So with that, I'll introduce a couple of members of our technical team. Dave O'Rourke, who's with GSI, who's the technical lead on the GSP work, and Robert Marks, who's been I would call him the principal hydrogeologist on the GSP. Both of them will be talking tonight, and so with that, I'll hand it over to Dave.
Hi, yeah. Again, I'm Dave O'Rourke. I've met most of you before. Just going to give you an outline of what we're going to be talking about tonight. Robert's going to give a pretty in-depth presentation on the predictive modeling simulations of the CAP project. And we're going to go back and do kind of a quick review of projects and management actions. It was surprising to me to see that we haven't had one of these since May. So we're just going to recap a couple of things. There's also been a little bit of rethinking about kind of the potential sequencing of projects. So we're going to go back over that stuff. Talk about the implementation plan, which is, that's the final chapter. It's getting written right now. And then just talk about the release of the document and the public review process. So without further ado, Mr. Robert Marks.
Thanks, Dave. Again, I'm Robert Marks, Principal Hydrogeologist with Pueblo Water Resources. And it's a great pleasure to be here again tonight. I think the last time I was here was April, so it's been a while. So I'm going to be talking tonight about the groundwater modeling that we've done for the CAP project, which Bob talked to you guys about at the meeting in May, is the recycled water project that is currently being designed and plan to go into implementation and start putting water in the basin in as early as 2027. So here's an outline of my presentation. First, I'm just going to give a review of the projected water budget and the associated groundwater model scenario that we've used to simulate the CAP project, moving into the 50-year planning horizon for the implementation of the GSP. So I'll give after I do that review, I'll give a description of the modeling that we've done of the CAP project, the different types of scenarios and the process that we went through to come up with what we're calling the final version or the final scenario that's going to be incorporated into the GSP, and what the results of that model scenario showed in terms of impact of the CAP project on the basin, specifically what the impacts to water levels in the basin are, and what it does to the water budget. And then I'll end by talking about the associated sustainable yield calculations for the basin, both with and without the CAP project. So first, the review of the projected water budget. I presented a fairly lengthy discussion back in February of the projected water budget, the process that we went through for developing that, DWR's requirements. So I'm just going to kind of brush over that just to refresh your memory, because we use that 50-year future projected water budget as the baseline for simulating the basin, moving out into the 50-year future, and then again superimposing the CAP project on that no project baseline. So again, the process that DWR has prescribed for developing the projected water budget is to use 50 years of historical climate data, specifically precipitation, evapotranspiration, stream flow, as the base for the future hydrologic conditions, while taking into consideration the effects of climate change on the various parts of the hydrologic budget. So what climate change is going to do to precipitation, evapotranspiration, stream flows, and not insignificantly rising sea level. And then that's, of course, coupled with the projected water demands both for district municipal pumping and agricultural pumping in the basin. So I presented this figure last time as well, or back in February, that shows sort of graphically the relationship between the different water budgets that we have to do in the GSP. We have a historical water budget that looks at the past. So for this GSP in this basin, our historical water budget period is 1985 through 2020. The current water budget is essentially right now, so we picked a small subset of that historical budget to represent the current conditions. And then there's the 50-year planning horizon that starts from the date of adoption of the GSP, which is going to be January of 2024, and then going out 50 years through the end of 2073. And so again, as I was describing, what we do to create this planning horizon is we take 50 years of historical data, and then we make adjustments or perturb it in the nomenclature of DWR to take into account the effects of climate change. So our baseline condition that we used for projecting 50 years into the future is the historical period of 1953 through 2002. So DWR has provided monthly climate change data sets, or what they call change factors, for these aspects of the water budget and the hydrology of the basin. So we have monthly change factors for that historical period. For precipitation, we see that it's expected that precipitation, as the climate warms, we'll actually see a little bit more precipitation in the basin than we saw historically. And of course, as things heat up, we've got more evapotranspiration, both from native vegetation as well as crops in the basin. Stream flow, of course, if we've got precipitation increasing, we have a relatively commensurate increase in stream flow. Sea level rise, the predictions for sea level rise are about 6 inches of sea level rise between now and 2030, and about 18 inches of sea level rise between now and 2070. So we've incorporated the rising sea level in the groundwater model. DWR also provides change factors for state water project deliveries, and that really is essentially inconsequential for this basin. It didn't make any change because you guys don't use a whole lot of state water project water anyway. So this is a complex graphic. There's a lot going on here, but basically what it does is it summarizes that 50-year projected water budget on an annualized basis. So we have the upper half of this graphic shows the combined inflows from all of the different sources of recharge and inflow to the basin for every year in these stacked bars. And what you can see is that on the recharge side, we have a pattern of, we can go many years with relatively low amounts of recharge in the basin, punctuated by occasional very wet periods. The bottom half of the graphic here shows the outflow from the basin, again on an annualized basis. And the main sources of outflow in the basin are pumping, of course, and then also subsurface outflow to the ocean. But what you can see here is that in contrast to the high variability of inflows, outflows are relatively constant. Pumping varies a little bit year to year, but not a whole lot. This black line shows the cumulative difference or the cumulative change in storage between inflows and outflows every year. And so what you can see is that because we have this relatively constant outflow, but sporadic periods of recharge, we go through periods of storage depletion, and then we get these shorter periods of storage accumulation. And again, that just reflects this variation between inflows and outflows through time. So we used that projected water budget and we created a groundwater model scenario that incorporates that groundwater budget using the calibrated groundwater model that I discussed. I think it might have been back in November now. So we have a groundwater model of the basin. It was calibrated to the historical period of 1985 through 2020. And then we took that calibrated model and created this projected future scenario. And we used that projected future scenario to run a variety of simulations of CAP to see, how we can operate CAP in a way that's technically feasible, and I'll talk about what the criteria for technical feasibility are, and then to assess what the impacts of that eventual technically feasible project is or might be on the basin, assuming this projected future actually occurs. So at the last meeting in May, Bob spent a fair amount of time talking about the CAP project. He gave you a lot of details about the CAP project. So here I just want to hit some of the highlights of it. I'm not going to go over all of that stuff. But basically what this is this is a recycled water project. It has a capacity of 1 MGD or 1 million gallons per day, which when that operates 24/7, 365 days a year, works out to be about 1,100 acre feet a year. The facilities consist of, at the Carpinteria wastewater treatment plant down here, a advanced water purification facility, or AWPF. There's a booster station that pumps that treated recycled water through a conveyance system across the freeway at the Linden overcross to a couple of injection well sites here. We have 2 injection wells, which I'll talk more about here in a moment. And then there is a series of monitoring wells that are associated with that CAP project that are required by the various regulators that have oversight responsibilities for a recycled water injection project. So this is a smaller scale or close-up map showing the locations of the 2 CAP injection wells. The first well that we're calling IPR1 is located at St. Joseph's Church at the intersection of Linden Avenue and El Caro Lane. And the second well is located at the end of Meadowview Lane here, adjacent to Franklin Creek, and just across the creek from Franklin Park here. So just to give you a sense of exactly where these wells are, I'm sure you folks are familiar with this area. Again, it's going right up Linden here on the side of the freeway. So this is a vertical schematic of one of the injection wells. They're both roughly the same. And I don't expect you to see all of these details, but basically we have in each one of these zones 3 separate screen zones corresponding to the A, B, and C zones. Total depths of these wells is about 1,200 feet deep, so they're quite deep. And each well is injecting at a rate of about 350 gallons a minute or a half MGD, so the 2 wells combined are injecting the 1 MGD output from the AWPF. So as I mentioned, we've used the model in this scenario to evaluate a few different types of project operational scenarios, which I'll be discussing here in the next few slides. The first is a so-called injection-only scenario. The second is a simultaneous, quote-unquote, put-and-take scenario. And then the third is this water level management scenario. So I'm going to talk about each of those here, again, over the next few slides. So shown here are water level hydrographs showing the simulated predicted water levels at each of these injection wells. So IPR1 here on the left, IPR2 on the right. And so we have through time here, so starting 2020 is the origin here, going out to, again, the scenario ends in 2073. And on each of these plots, I'm showing 2 different simulation results. The black water level lines on each of these plots is the no project baseline water level conditions at these injection well sites. So there's no injection occurring. This is what the water levels, the predicted water levels at those sites look like. So for the injection-only scenario, the only thing we did is we applied that 350 gallon a minute of injection at each one of these wells, and we didn't make any other changes to the scenario. We didn't change pumping or anything else. We just started injecting to see what would happen with the water levels. And so that's the red lines here on these graphs. And what you can see is that within about 10 years of project operation, we have water levels in the aquifer system going way above ground surface at both of these wells. And that is not a technically feasible operation. We can't have water levels in the aquifer system at these injection well sites exceeding the ground surface for a variety of reasons, but the principal reasons are that there's the potential for groundwater basically daylighting at the ground surface, creating artesian conditions, which in addition to just sort of creating a nuisance, wet water on the ground everywhere, that also represents a significant potential for loss of water from the basin, right? If it's squirting out at the ground surface and running down the creeks or being evaporated, we're losing water. So one of the principal technical feasibility criteria for this injection well project is maintaining water levels at these injection well sites at or below ground surface at all times. So that took us to the next type of simulation, which we're calling simultaneous put and take. So in this scenario, we kept the injection rates at the same rates as the previous injection-only scenario, but then we increased the pumping of the district's headquarters and El Caro wells by a half MGD each. So we left their baseline pumping alone and we just pumped them harder. So basically, as we're injecting a combined 1 MGD at these two injection wells, we're pulling an extra 1 MGD out between the two districts' wells. And what you can see is that that results in a technically feasible project operation. We're able to maintain water levels, you know, they go up 5 or 10 feet above baseline, but otherwise we keep them essentially at or below ground surface at all times. So this would be considered, you know, you could stop here and say, okay, that works. But, you know, you look at this a little carefully, you can see that we have significant periods here where we have some additional freeboard here where we could back off on pumping and allow water levels at these well sites and then the basin as a whole, which I'll talk about here in a little bit, to provide some additional benefit to the basin while also maintaining a technically feasible project operation. So that's what we started doing, what we're calling this water level management type of scenario. And the way this worked is we iterated between the groundwater model and the water district's water supply and demand model, where they track on a spreadsheet their various demands and their various sources of supply, native groundwater, and then the CAP project being a couple of the sources, but also Cachuma. Not just, you know, how much water they can take out of Cachuma on any given year, but also it tracks the storage in Cachuma through time. And so Pueblo, working with district staff, we did a variety of iterations of modifying the district pumping to both meet district demands, right? They got to keep meeting demands, but also backing off on pumping as much as possible while maintaining water levels at or below ground surface at these injection wells. We did a total of 6 iterations, and so we've creatively called this scenario CAP 6. And so again, on these plots, the same type of plots, we have, we have the black line. It's the same black line that you saw on the previous slides as the no project baseline, and then the purple line is the simulated water levels under this water level management scenario. And so you can see that, for one thing, we get water levels in this first, you know, decade or so come to ground surface pretty close after we start project operation in 2027. And again, the district is trying to balance its water demands with its other sources of supply in addition to recovering water from the CAP project. Yes, sir?
Does the district have ability to bank water in Cachuma?
I believe so.
Yeah, it's at risk. We can bank it there, but if the reservoir spills, we lose any water we're banked.
Yeah. So it's because of this balancing of all of these different factors that we don't, with this what we're calling a final iteration, our water levels aren't just flatlined here. We still need to pump, and it varies somewhat depending on what the supply and demand portfolio looks like, storage in Kachuma, and again, meeting demands. So this is what the predicted water levels are going to look like, again, at this final scenario. And so this CAP 6 scenario is going to be incorporated into the GSP. So over the next several slides, I'm going to be talking, and yes, sir.
Before you move on, do you mind backing up to the last slide?
Mm-hmm.
I just got in, so maybe I missed it, but I'm confused as to why the baseline without any injections shows the water levels going up between now and 2070.
Basically because we have the inflow and outflow balance of the basin under these assumed hydrologic conditions coming out of the current basin low conditions. So the basin right now and at the start of this simulation is at almost its lowest point that it's historically been. And so what's happened, we've been between the district and the agricultural pumping. The pumping over this drought period starting in 2012 has been very high. So when we move into this projected climate, and again, you missed this part, but we're using the historical period of 1953 through 2002 with perturbation or adjustments made for climate change. So it basically just means that we're coming out of a basin low situation, and then we go back into kind of a normal, quote unquote, more normal hydrologic regime, and that allows water levels to sort of slowly increase without any kind of project.
So
yeah.
Cautiously optimistic, assuming things are going to get better.
Well,
I like it.
yeah.
Thanks for explaining that.
Sure thing. Yes, sir.
Wasn't the 50s were a drought too, right? So, I mean, if we're coming out of a low point and then our historical time series we're using goes right into another drought, so that's another reason why it's low at the beginning.
Yeah.
Thanks.
And the 90s drought is reflected, I believe, there in the dip in the black line.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yep.
So this period here around the projected 2050s, early 2060s, where we see water levels going down here, that corresponds to the historical period that we're sort of assuming is going to happen again. So that's what this drought or this dip is it's that hydrologic, those hydrologic conditions that we saw in the 87 through 1990 or so. Yes, sir.
Does that consider that wells on the other surrounding areas have been pumping a lot more now than they were back in the 50s and 60s?
Yes. 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 So for the 50-year projected scenario, the only information or data that we're using from the 50-year past is hydrology, precipitation, ET, stream flow, etc. The pumping that we used in this scenario is projected pumping by the district. So we used the district's urban water management plan, how much they plan on pumping the basin. So the district, their plans for pumping the basin in the future is very different than how they've pumped in the past. And then we've used similar assumptions about projected agricultural pumping, which is essentially that ag pumping is not going to change much moving ahead, at least in the long-term average. We do have in this scenario a slight overall increase in agricultural pumping that's caused by the increase in evapotranspiration, which increases the demands of the plants, and so you got to pump a little more to overcome the soil moisture deficiencies that the extra ET creates. So again, we're not using what pumping was back in the 50s. We're assuming the pumping is what the district plans on doing, and again, assumptions about what agriculture is going to do.
Can you grab the mic? Can you grab the mic? Just pull it up. I'm just chilling up. I'm wondering about the change factors. Do they evolve over time from year to year?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Yep, monthly. I talked a lot about this back in whatever it was, April, I think, and how DWR developed these change factors is a very complex and complicated process. But basically what they did is they took an ensemble of all of the various global circulation models and came up with what they called a central tendency of all the different models. So if you look at climate change model predictions, depending on which model you're talking about, whether it's, the European model or the GFDL model or what have you, you get very different predictions of potential future. So DWR, is my understanding, has sort of distilled all of that down to kind of come up with what they think is their best guess, most likely scenario. So how does the CAP project affect water levels in the basin? I'm going to present to you the water levels, simulated water levels, both for project and no project, and with the CAP 6 project for the 9 RMS water level wells, or the representative monitoring site water level wells, that Dave has been talking to you guys about on 2 or 3 of the previous workshops. So Dave has talked to you guys about what the basis for selecting those wells were, where they are, what the minimum water level thresholds are, or the MT levels. You might recall him talking about MTs and MOs. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you what this looks like moving forward in this 50-year planning horizon at all 9 of these wells, which are going to be used in the GSP for demonstrating to DWR that we have a sustainable basin plan.
What were the agencies you said that you had to put those wells in? You said there were agencies that said you needed to put those monitoring wells?
Oh, yeah, sorry. There's a sort of an apples and oranges thing. These monitoring wells here that I'm going to be talking about here in a moment are existing monitoring wells in the basin that have been used by the district, and some of them used by the USGS going back to like the 1940s as part of the district's ongoing management of the basin. The monitoring wells that I was referring to earlier when I was talking about the CAP project are very project-specific monitoring wells that are very close. They're in the project area, so they're right in the vicinity of the injection wells and the district's 2 wells that are recovering the CAP project. Those 2 wells are not water level RMS wells. The agencies that require those monitoring wells for the CAP project, the main one is Division of Drinking Water. When you're injecting recycled water into a potable aquifer, there are all sorts of requirements in terms of residence times, like how long that water stays in the ground before it reaches any pumping well. And there are requirements by that agency, for locating and monitoring wells in the project area to basically confirm that the projected travel times and residence times of that recycled water are actually occurring.
That's state?
I'm sorry?
That's state?
Yes, state.
Yeah, and I'll follow up on that if I may. So there will be required 4 monitoring wells for the CAP project. Those will be clustered monitoring wells, which are there'll be 3 individual wells going down to each A, B, and C zones. And those may be in the implementation period. We have 20 years to implement the GSP. Those may be reconsidered as potential RMS wells. We had to select wells that are existing, right now in order to develop the RMS network. So it may occur in 5 years when the CAP project's done, and we may look at these wells and say these are actually better representing the water conditions than the wells that we selected initially. So there's a possibility that those wells will be used for Sigma.
Yeah, I'm wondering if you might have been confused, or if you're aware, the RMS, that's not a regulatory body. That stands for Representative Monitoring Site. Those are just wells we picked that we said are representative throughout the basin.
Yeah, I don't know if you assume that the general public would know every other word is an abbreviation that you guys talk about. And,
Yeah.
I don't think if this is an information meeting,
Yeah.
you should probably give the information that's not abbreviated for people that don't know.
Okay.
Fair enough. So moving on, so the RMS well locations, or representative monitoring site locations. This map shows the map of the basin. So the black line is the basin boundary. The 2 CAP injection wells are these red points here. And then these 9 RMS monitoring well sites are shown by the blue points, and they're spread throughout the basin to, monitor conditions throughout the basin. So I'm just going to start by looking at the simulated water levels starting on the west side of the basin here, and we'll just kind of work our way around the horn here. So this first one is well 19F4. It's located here on this inset map. So this is a smaller version of the map I just showed you. So it's located here. So similar to the water level hydrographs that I was showing you for the IPR wells, we're presenting both the no project baseline water levels here in the sort of grayed out black line, and then the heavy purple line is what the water levels, simulated water levels with the CAP project are. So again, we have on the x-axis, or the horizontal axis here, through time starting in 2020, going out to 2073. We've put on this figure the minimum threshold, or MT level, that was assigned to this well that, again, Dave has discussed previously, as well as the measurable objective, or MO level. And this vertical yellow line demarks January of 2044, which is 20 years from the date of GSP adoption, and that is the key milestone under Sigma that we have to show that we're meeting the minimum thresholds by 2044, and then maintaining that throughout the remainder of the 50-year planning horizon. So what you can see at this location is that with or without the CAP project, we're meeting the minimum threshold levels at this location. But I think what's relevant in terms of the CAP project is that we do see a benefit here with the water levels increasing particularly early on in the project operation, because you might recall I talked about how we backed off on pumping at the beginning because we have this additional freeboard, if you will, to allow water levels to increase in the project area by backing off on pumping while maintaining the constant rate of injection. And that impact of the water levels in the project area propagates to other areas of the basin and provides a benefit. So, you know, our injection wells are here, but we're looking at water level impacts way over here. So you can see we get, you know, 5, 10, 15 feet of water level increase or benefit, at least during the first few decades of project operation. But then as water levels, you know, in the basin start to increase, we're operating CAP more in a put and take operation. Once water levels get high, we have to keep pumping to keep water levels where they need to be at the injection wells, again, while also meeting district demands. Yes, sir.
Are you surprised at the response in the early years of your model run? It seems like it's quite a long ways from your extraction wells. I don't know. It seems surprising to me, that's all.
No, not really. We'll get to some wells where we don't see any effect, and we can explore why that is. And I think, you know, it'll start to make a little more sense. You know, so even though we are, you know, whatever that is, a couple miles away from the injection well sites, this well is still in the sort of the low-lying area of the basin. You know, the elevation here is only about 100 feet or so. The elevations, ground surface elevations in the project area are about 50 feet. So, and we are talking about injecting into the A, B, and C zones, which are confined aquifers. And so the water level response to pumping and injection in confined zones is a pressure response, which propagates much farther than if we were in an unconfined aquifer. And I realize I'm using terms that folks may or may not be familiar with, but that's a big reason why we see the effects of injection and pumping in the central part of the basin propagates at such large distances, is because of that confined condition, the pressure response, and the very low storage coefficient. I could go on about elasticity and, you know, there's a lot to it, but the simple answer to your question is no, I'm not terribly surprised. So just sort of moving eastward here, so we were looking at this well over there. Now we're coming eastward here. This is 20K4, the district's high school well. This is at the high school here off of Foothill. And this well is very close to the CAP project wells. And what you can see here is, you know, water levels almost mimic what they were at the IPR wells themselves. Again, they're really just kind of a, you know, John Elway could probably throw a rock from the IPR wells to this well. So again, this is not surprising at all to see this kind of effect. And again, we're meeting minimum thresholds here, in particular by January 2044. And in some years, we're even hitting the measurable objectives at this location, or the MOs. So again, just moving around the basin here, a little further northeast of the high school well, 21L1, and we see a similar pattern here. Meeting the minimum thresholds, we see a water level benefit. We don't quite get to measurable objectives at this location. Now moving further east to the other side of the CAP project wells now, this is 27F2, or the district Smiley well, which is like right around the corner here, right at the intersection of Foothill and Carpinteria Creek. And, you know, we see a similar thing here, not nearly as a dramatic of an impact at this well than as we saw at the other two that are closer to the project area. But we do see some benefits there. And again, most importantly, we're meeting minimum thresholds throughout the 50-year planning horizon. Now this well is interesting. So this is well 26A1. There's my pointer. So this well is way up here. So this is up in the uplands area, kind of in the vicinity of Shepherd Mesa. It's near the bedrock boundary. It's at an elevation of 425 feet, so it's way up there. And basically what you can see is the CAP project water level plots right on top of the projected baseline. So we're not seeing any impact from CAP up there. And that's not surprising, primarily because of the elevation difference, right? Water flows downhill at the risk of sounding glib. So in order to affect water levels that are at elevations of 150 to 175 feet, we would need to get water levels at the injection well sites that high in order to push them up. And that's just, as I discussed before, that's not a feasible project operation. And so again, because of that, the setting and the location and the depths of these wells, this result is not surprising. So CAP doesn't have any effect on water levels here, but even in the absence of CAP, you know, we have this minimum threshold level. You know, we're hitting it in a lot of these years. In particular, we get close to it in this this drought period here that we talked about before, coincides with the hydrologic conditions of the 87 to 90 drought period. But we're above the minimum threshold here, so and we're you know 5 feet above it or so when we get to 2043. So so again, CAP doesn't have much impact here, but we're still meeting the minimum threshold requirements regardless. So coming back down the hill, back into the center part of the basin here, so we're just coming back to the same area where we had talked about earlier, and we see similar results again. We see pretty significant impact from CAP, particularly in the first couple of decades. Again, meeting minimum thresholds, getting close to the measurable objective here, but not quite getting there. Similar situation here. This is the district's Lyons well. It's pretty close to the project area. And so we see a similar effect here as we saw at like 20K4, for example, on the other side of the project, but it's roughly proximate and completed in the same zones, comparable elevation. So again, we're meeting the minimum thresholds here. This is the district's headquarters well. So this is located here. It's pretty close to the coast. It's right off the freeway. And the district's headquarters well, in addition to being an RMS well site, there are 2 wells at the site. We're having discussions about which one we want to call the RMS well. But this is the simulated water levels at, excuse me, the headquarters well, and I believe I mentioned before, the headquarters well is one of the CAP recovery wells. So as they're injecting the water, headquarters is specifically identified and used to recover the CAP water, in addition to the other district well that's on the other side of the injection well is the El Caro #2 well that's located at El Caro Park. And so because we're pumping this well, to recover cap water, we see a little bit of a water level benefit here in these early days, but otherwise there's not a huge difference between the no project water levels here and the project water levels, which is to be expected, again, because we're pumping this well pretty hard. But we are meeting minimum thresholds by 2044. We're getting close to the minimum threshold here in this drought period, but we're getting close to the measurable objective here, but not quite getting there. So now this well is a different animal, a little bit than the other wells. So this well is 35E1. It's located here in the basin. This is on the south side of the Rincon Creek Fault in so-called storage unit number 2. And what you can see here is that the CAP project has a relatively limited impact on water levels at this location. We do see a small benefit. It looks like maybe 5 feet or so of increase above the no project. And again, that's to be expected. The Rincon Creek Fault represents a hydraulic barrier to flow, but it's not impervious. There is some amount of flow that goes across that boundary. It's not like, there's like a wall of concrete there that completely separates them. So the Rincon Creek Fault has the effect of significantly reducing the amount of flow across that boundary, but it doesn't completely eliminate it, and it doesn't completely eliminate the hydraulic response either. So that's why we are seeing a little bit of an effect here. But perhaps not insignificant, in the absence of the CAP project, we're not able to meet the minimum threshold levels at this well. But with the CAP project, we're getting that little extra 5 feet or so, and we're like right on the MT line there.
Yeah, I just want to jump in real quick about the fact that this model result shows we're having trouble hitting the minimum threshold in this well. Not too sure if that's actually going to be the case. One of the first 5-year implementation things would be to gather more data at this well. Like Robert said, this is in the fault block. There's not a whole lot of, real good hydrogeologic understanding of how things are flowing across that fault block. So I was talking to Bob about, probably put a transducer in there and get some continuous water levels over the first 5 years. Maybe get a video, basically get a little better characterization of that area. So I just wanted to say the fact that this well in this relatively uncharacterized area, that the model is showing it having a hard time hitting the minimum threshold. Maybe not, it's sort of like with the Sentinel well areas. We need to get a little better data in this area. So. But we need a well over there. It's the best well with the best period of record in that fault block area. So I just wanted to.
Yep.
So, hearing what you just said, isn't stability still worth a lot? We're not seeing swings or anything there. So yeah, it may be down, but it's not. Isn't that worth something?
Yeah, it's worth something.
Absolutely.
And the question is whether it's really going to stabilize at that low level or whether it'll, hang out somewhere between the minimum threshold and the measurable objective. So, this is based on, we picked the minimum thresholds based on the recent low water levels, and those are measured twice a year, 4 times a year. Anyway, this is a good candidate for getting a transducer in there and getting some good continuous data and seeing what happens in the next 5 years. But yeah, stability is better than wild fluctuations in water levels, in the stock market, anything.
So you specified that this well is on the south side of the Rincon Fault, and isn't also the injection wells or the cap wells are on that same side of the fault?
No,
No,
the
they're on the
injection
north
well's
side.
on the north side, yeah.
Okay,
Yep.
great.
Yeah, just using this inset map, so this is the well we're talking about.
Mhm.
This is the Rincon Creek Fault right here.
Okay.
And our injection wells are right around here.
Yeah, really every other well we're talking about and showing here is north of the Rincon Creek
Okay.
Fault.
Yeah, yeah.
Is that well near like the industrial park or Baylord Avenue?
I believe it's over by the old airport. So you can think of the Rincon Fault as the Highway 192 as it runs along that, just before it hits 150, it runs along that, and there's sort of a shelf. That's sort of the reverse scarp of the 192. And then it cuts through Ewell Lake and then kind of goes towards the slough.
Yeah,
So everything south of that is storage unit number 2.
great. Thank you. And so my second question, in seeing this projection and the CAP project not influencing the well level much, and then thinking about the wells where the water level will be increased and the district will maybe be having to pump more out of those wells than they have been to prevent water from daylighting, and that issue that you explained, would that suggest then that the district might be able to back off its pumping on this well, or say the Shepherd Mesa Gubendor area well that is not seeing the benefit of water level rise from the CAP project, but maybe will gain some benefit by lessened pumping because these other wells are having to be pumped more? Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think it's important to understand that the district only has 3 active wells in the basin. The headquarters well, the El Caro well, and then the Smiley well, all of which are in the central part of the basin here. So the district doesn't have any pumping wells on the south side of the fault, nor do they have any pumping wells up there by Shepherd Mesa. The closest well to 26A1 in the Shepherd Mesa area is this well right over here, the Smiley well. So
Yeah, they're just monitoring wells.
These are all privately owned wells that we've got an agreement with the
Right.
owner to monitor those.
yeah, of these 9 RMS wells or representative monitoring site wells that I've shown you, the only one that's an active district pumping well was the headquarters well. All the others are existing agricultural wells that may or not even be pumped. So that's the water level impacts at the RMS wells that are in the RMS wells are in the GSP. We need to show that we're able to meet the minimum thresholds by 2044. But as we've talked about many times in the basin, about this GSP, you know, the main concern, or one of the main concerns in this basin, is the potential for seawater intrusion. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about what the water level impacts at the coast are with and without the CAP project. Now, none of the hydrographs and the water levels that I'm going to show you have had minimum thresholds established for them, so we're not talking about, you know, hitting MTs at these next several wells, but it's incredibly relevant about what the implementation plan is going to look like, and where we're going to go from here with this GSP. So if you were here, you may recall that we had talked a lot about the fact that the water district has installed in 2019 the first seawater intrusion sentinel well in the basin. The well was drilled, it's a monitoring well cluster, meaning we have 3 separate boreholes and 3 separate wells in each of the 3 zones. The well is located basically right at the intersection of, well, it's right near the on-ramp of Santa Claus Lane by the marsh. I'm going to show you the next 3 slides of what the water level, simulated projected water levels in the 3 zones at this location, again, right on the coast, looks like. So starting shallow, and then we'll go deep. So this is a plot, or 2 plots of the water levels at the shallow A-zone well. So again, just like all of the other graphics that I've shown you, the black line here is the no project scenario, and the purple line is the with the CAP project. And what you can see here is that, you know, we do see pretty significant benefits in this zone at this location. Again, we don't have MTs or MOs set for this location, but the black line here that I'm showing is the protective elevation that the water level at this well would need to be to overcome the density differences between seawater and freshwater to hold seawater back. So we have to get water levels, freshwater water levels higher than just sea level in order to keep seawater from intrusion, because seawater is denser than freshwater, and all other things being equal, the denser water will move down gradient, basically, or downhill. So for this site, because the bottom of the A zone is at a depth of around 300 feet or so, we need to get the water level to achieve that protective elevation up to 3.5 feet. So here, CAP, we actually hit that mark, at least by 2043, but we're not able to maintain it there. But the CAP project does provide some benefit here. And when I talk about the water budget and what changes we're seeing in subsurface inflow from the ocean boundary, this is the reason we're seeing those differences that I'll come back to here in a few minutes. So moving deeper down into the B zone now, we see similar level of benefit or water level impact here. But water levels either with the project or no project, or, you know, right around an elevation of 0 or so, maybe a little higher. And because this zone is much deeper, we're talking about 800 feet or so, the protective elevation, or the freshwater equivalent head that's necessary to overcome the density differences, is higher. It's 14.5 feet. So we've got a ways to go in this zone to get the water levels high enough to hold back seawater. And then this is the C zone, similar story to the B zone. CAP project does provide some benefits. It does slow the rate of seawater intrusion, which I'll talk about more in a moment. But again, because this well is around 900, 1,000 feet deep or so, we got to get the water levels pretty high to overcome the density differences that deep. So we're talking almost 22 feet elevation. And again, we've got a ways to go at this location. So now I'm going to look at the same kind of thing, water levels at the coast, in a slightly different manner. The next 3 slides.
Hey Robert,
Yes, sir.
before you move on,
So I just want to make it clear that these protective elevations are based on an approach and some assumptions about what the geology is between the ocean and the basin. And we do plan to continue to study it to see if we can refine that. So we basically had to come up with a number. We took a basic approach, made some assumptions. That's where these numbers. You can see, you might ask yourself, we're about on the C zone about 12 feet above the ground surface at the Sentinel well. So does that mean essentially water is bubbling out of the well? And certainly if you got this level, that's what would be happening. You have to pressurize those casings. And so again, we're looking at it very broadly at this point. And when we get into the management actions, we'll talk a little bit about some of the steps we'll take in between getting those water levels to that elevations, just to verify that our assumptions are correct.
Yeah, there's going to be, there are a lot of uncertainties associated with the relationship of the basin and the ocean, in particular in this deeper zone. There's just not a whole lot of information about what the hydraulic conductivity of the sands in those zones are, a variety of other things. So Dave will talk when I'm done here. He'll talk a little bit about the types of studies and things that are going to be put into the implementation plan for the GSP to get at this issue. Yes, sir.
So when you're talking about the fresh water holding back the salt water, is that fresh water being lost in that process? Is it pushing out into the salt water and basically going out into the...
To some extent, yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, you
So
need...
it's not just a wall, it's a pressure flow, really, isn't it? Or...
Yeah,
Yeah.
I got a little cartoon I'm going to show, and when Robert's done, that it's sort of like sitting on a wedge, the fresh water's sitting on a wedge of salt water and keeping it from advancing.
Yeah. So again, a couple more slides just to reinforce the picture that we're painting here. The next three slides are, again, we're starting from the A zone, going deeper, B zone, C zone. What these are showing, there's quite a lot going on here. I'll try to simplify this. What this is showing is basically a water level line right along the shoreline that's shown here. So this is what the model simulated water levels on a line here along the shoreline. So starting up here in the northwestern portion of the basin towards the boundary with Montecito, and then extending southeast till we get the edge of the line here is right at the Rincon Creek Fault, or the edge of Storage Unit 1. Each one of these individual lines is showing the average water level averaged over a decade through time over the 50-year period relative to changing sea level. So in the model, we're increasing the elevation of the ocean, shown here how it's ramping up. And I mentioned earlier that the prediction is 6 inches of water level rise by 2030, about 18 inches or 1.5 feet of water level rise or sea level rise by 2070. So the head boundary in the model is being increased. So 0 on this graph is its relative, meaning for 2020 to 2033, the head or the elevation relative to 0 is 3.6, and then we get all the way to 4.74 in the 60s and early 70s there. So all of that being said, what this shows is that In the northwestern portion of the basin in the A zone, we have water levels that are above sea level as sea level is rising. But then as we get more towards the central part of the basin and we get down here to the Rincon Creek Fault, we've got, sort of a chronic depression here. We have chronic water levels below that ocean boundary level. Going deeper now, so this is the B zone, same head boundary, same decadal averages, but a little bit different pattern. We've got some pretty high water levels here. Now the cross-section length is extended here, so now we're right up against the boundary with Montecito here. So we got water levels over there, well above sea level. But again, as we start heading south, southeast, and getting more towards the central part of the basin, and in particular, when we get to the part of the basin where the Rincon Creek Fault runs offshore, we got water levels 15, 25 feet below the head, the simulated seawater or sea level. And this is the C zone, same plot. Notwithstanding, what's going on in this part of the basin, we see a similar issue here in the central part of the basin. Again, we have water levels 15, 25 feet below sea level, depending on which time period you're looking at. Now, to tie this back to the Sentinel well hydrographs that I was showing you a few slides ago, those Sentinel wells are located about here on the section or about here. So the Sentinel wells aren't actually located in the, for lack of a better way of putting it, the worst spot of the basin. We see up against the Rincon Creek Fault, in part because it represents this low flow boundary condition, sort of an exacerbation or an intensification of the depression up against that boundary. So this is going to be, a lot of work is going to need to happen to get a better handle on understanding exactly what's going on in this area of the basin, and then also developing a plan to do something about it. So that's it for the water level impacts. Now I'm going to move to the water budget impacts. So how does CAP affect the accounting of inflows minus outflows, change in storage? So this is a graphic, the same graphic I showed you 20 minutes ago, 30 minutes ago at the beginning for the no project scenario. It's the exact same graphic, just with the CAP project added to it. So on the inflow side, in purple here, sort of pushing all these bars up by the same amount, 1,100 acre-feet a year of injection. And then recovery on the bottom part of the graphic here. And then again, the black line is the cumulative change in storage, or the difference between inflows and outflows each year, cumulatively, year to year to year. And not unlike the the no project scenario, this cumulative change in storage curve is relatively flat, but we do see at the end of the 50-year run a relatively modest deficit of about 10,000 acre-feet a year. So here's a table that puts numbers to what I was showing you graphically. And what this table is it's a comparison of the no project baseline and the CAP 6 project, summarizing the average annual volumes over that 50-year period for each component of the water budget. So we have inflows, we have subsurface inflow, stream bed percolation, percolation of precipitation, percolation of irrigation water, inflow from the Montecito basin across the boundary, and I'm going to come back to this, subsurface inflow across the boundary. So this is the model simulated amount of water that's coming from the ocean side of the boundary into the basin. And then on the outflow side, we have relatively minor boundary flows. By far the largest source of outflow in the basin is pumping. So starting with the no project baseline, over that 50-year period, we have an average annual amount of inflow of about 4,700 acre-feet a year, roughly. I'll call it 4,670 for this discussion. And then an outflow of 4,870 acre-feet a year, which results in a slight deficit, or slightly more outflow than inflow, of about 200 acre-feet a year on average. So going back to what I said on the previous slide, at the end of that 50-year period, we have a cumulative deficit of 10,000 acre-feet a year. 200 times 50 years, that's how you get the 10,000. Now with the CAP project, same components. There aren't much differences between, percolation or precipitation, subsurface inflow, those parts of the inflow, which you would expect, right? I mean, the CAP project's not going to have an effect on rainfall or precipitation. I'll come back to subsurface inflow from the ocean boundary here in a moment, but basically we've added to the inflow side of the equation the CAP injection. Now over that 50-year period, it averages out to about 1,050 acre-feet a year. You've heard me and Bob talking about 1,100 acre-feet a year, and you might ask, well, why isn't it 1,100? It's because the project's not going to start until 2027, but the 50-year period starts in 2024. So over that 50-year period, there are a couple, 3 years there where CAP's not running. So that's why that average number is what it is. So with the CAP project, we now have a total amount of inflow of about 5,600 acre-feet a year. A little bit of a difference in district pumping because, as I was describing earlier, we were able to back off a little bit on the district pumping of native groundwater. So we have a little bit less pumping of native groundwater by the district under the CAP scenario. And then we're basically recovering all of the CAP water. So, the CAP project is a water supply project, as I think Bob discussed. It is not intended to be a basin restoration project. It's a water supply project. So if they're going to build $50 million project, they're recovering that water. But again, it does allow them to back off a little bit on their take of native groundwater. So we wind up with a commensurate increase in outflow. We get to about 5,800 acre-feet a year, and we wind up with a comparable deficit of about 200 acre-feet a year, again, still with the CAP project. Now, in addition to the water level impacts and the beneficial impacts that the CAP project is anticipated to have, that I've spent the past 20 minutes or so talking about, the other thing that the model results are showing is that because we are increasing water levels at the coast a little bit, We do see a benefit in terms of a reduction in the amount of subsurface inflow that's coming in from the ocean with the CAP project. It's actually about a 25% reduction in the amount of potential seawater intrusion because of the CAP project. So with the CAP, without the CAP project, you know, we've got about 440 acre-feet a year coming in from the ocean boundary. We're dropping that down to about 320, 325 or so. And then again, the other benefit of the CAP project is this reduction in the native groundwater pumping by the district. So moving on, what does all this mean for sustainable yield in the basin, right? What is the sustainable yield of the basin with or without the project? A common misconception about sustainable yield, or it used to be called safe yield of a groundwater basin, is that the safe yield or sustainable yield is equal to the amount of recharge. Right? I mean, that kind of makes intuitive sense. If we've got 4,600 acre-feet a year recharge, that's the sustainable yield. But it's not, because the ability to effectively capture all of that recharge without any adverse impacts is virtually impossible. So the sustainable yield of any given groundwater basin from a practical standpoint is always going to be something less than the amount of recharge. And this is particularly relevant in the context of SGMA and meeting the sustainable management criteria, or the SMCs. So the way that sustainable yield is really calculated is that it's the total amount of pumping plus or minus the change in storage, and then in a coastal basin, we need to subtract out the inflow from the ocean boundary, because even though on the water budget side, we have water coming into the basin and it's contributing to the inflow of the overall water budget equation, that doesn't represent usable water. So we can't count inflow from the ocean in the water budget as part of the sustainable yield. So that's why in a coastal basin, the equation for calculating sustainable yield includes this consideration for inflow from the ocean. So the way that math works out for the no project scenario, we have total pumping of about 4,360 acre-feet a year. We have that roughly 200 acre-feet a year deficit that I was talking about, and then again about 440 acre-feet of inflow from the ocean boundary, and that works out to a sustainable yield value of about 3,700 acre-feet a year. With the CAP scenario, that increases the sustainable yield. So now we're increasing pumping to capture the CAP project water, relatively same amount of change in storage and a little bit less amount of inflow coming from the ocean. So we wind up with a sustainable yield value of about 4,800 acre-feet a year. Now, just for reference, previous estimates of the sustainable yield of the basin have ranged between 3,600 to 4,000 acre-feet a year, depending on the method that was used to calculate it and the time period. So obviously those previous, well, maybe not obviously, but those previous estimates did not include the CAP project. So our current sustainable yield, no project sustainable yield estimate of 3,700 acre-feet a year, while at the low end, is within the range of previous estimates. So we're not coming up with something any different than we've all known for the past, 15 years or so. Yes, sir.
This is Kachuma water or with?
Yeah.
With.
Yeah, Robert, can you repeat the question since he's not talking into the microphone?
The gentleman asked if this includes Kachuma water. And yes, it does. The Kachuma project is part of the district's overall water supply portfolio. So the district meets its demands, both agricultural deliveries as well as municipal demands, through a combination of, historically, a combination of pumping native groundwater and importing water from the Kachuma project. And then moving forward, starting in 2027, added to that portfolio is going to be the CAP project. So we're talking about the sustainable yield of the groundwater basin itself. This is not, so this number, the 3,700 acre feet a year number or the 4,700 acre feet a year number, that is part of the district's overall portfolio. So I think maybe if what you're asking is, does the district, do these numbers include the yield of the Kachuma project?
You talked about sustainable inflow. You talked about inflow, right?
Mm-hmm. To the groundwater basin.
Right. So if there's inflow from Lake Kachuma, is that considered the same formula as inflow from, is that what you're assuming both? Their inflow?
Well, so to the extent that Kachuma, imported Kachuma water adds to or affects the groundwater basin, it is really only in the agricultural return flows associated with the district's deliveries of Kachuma water to agriculture. Otherwise, the municipal demands, they bring it in through the South Coast conduit and it goes directly to homes. It doesn't, that amount of water that comes in from the Kachuma project never even sees the groundwater basin. No. Now, one of the potential projects and management actions moving forward that Dave is going to be talking about here in a few minutes is a concept called aquifer storage and recovery that has been studied in the basin for the water district over the past decade or so. And should that project or a variation of that project be implemented, one of the potential sources for that aquifer storage and recovery project would be Kachuma water. In particular, when Kachuma is full and spilling, which hasn't happened in a long time, but it has happened, of rather than letting the Kachuma spill and that water just going down the San Ynez River and wasting away, is to inject that water into the groundwater basin. But that would need to be in other injection wells. You wouldn't inject that water into the CAP wells. There would be other project wells for that.
Was there another project also with with Casitas? Is that still alive?
Yeah, I can answer that. So the question is there another project with Casitas Water District? There's an intertie project that's been proposed that is approaching the completion of final design. That project is meant to connect the Casitas Water District to their state water allocation. So if they would like, they could lease the facilities that the Santa Barbara County already owns to move their water through and into their service area. It also has the benefit of creating an emergency intertie for Santa Barbara County in case the conduit, which is a single pipeline, gets damaged and is out of service for a period of time. Along with that project, there may be opportunities to work with each other to store water in the Carpinteria Groundwater Basin, but those are very preliminary.
All right, I think this is about my last slide. So just to kind of recap, summarize, I've mentioned all of these things already, but I want to reinforce and And again, just sort of summarize what the benefits of the CAP project appear to be based on the simulations that we've run with this type of project operation. So one, it does increase water levels at the representative monitoring site or RMS monitoring wells. It reduces inflow from the ocean boundary, which is significant. It allows for a relatively minor reduction in the district's pumping of native groundwater. It's important to understand that the district is pumping every year, no matter what, at least 1,100 acre-feet a year to recover the CAP water. And there are some years in this scenario, especially in those early years, where the only pumping the district is doing is recovering CAP. They're not pumping any native groundwater in some of these years. But again, in other years, in order to meet demands and depending on what's going on with storage at Kachuma and everything else, they do still need to pump some amount of native groundwater. And then it just increases the sustainable yield by 1,100 acre-feet a year. Any additional questions?
So the lake water goes to just ag?
No, sir. The district provides Kachuma water to all of its customers, which includes both ag and municipal. I don't know offhand what the relative proportion
About 50-50.
is. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, it's about 50-50. 50% of the customers of the water that we serve to customers goes to ag, and 50% goes to what we call M&I, which is municipal and industrial use, includes
But it's not like certain customers get lake water and certain customers get...
From a molecule standpoint, that would be very difficult to define.
Okay.
But I wanted to come back to an earlier question. So the only mechanism for, other than artificial aquifer storage and retrieval projects where we actually purposely build a well and inject the imported water into the groundwater basin, there's only one mechanism for that water to make it into the groundwater basin. So Kachuma water is delivered to agricultural users and to some degree non-agricultural. That water is applied to crops and irrigation. Some of that water goes to the plant, but the rest of it moves past the root zones and back into the ground, back far enough into the groundwater basin that it gets captured in the overall storage of the groundwater basin. So we calculate every year in the water budget what we call return flows. So that water, whether it's from Kachuma or from wells pumping or from us pumping out of wells, it all hits the ground. Some of it gets used up by the plants, and the rest makes it into the groundwater basin.
Yeah, and we account for that in the water budget inventory and the model scenario. And that's what this is. So we have percolation of irrigation water, and we've segregated it between delivered and pumped. The pumped value is the amount of percolation of irrigation water as a result of pumping by agricultural itself, pumping their own wells. And then the delivered water, so we're talking about 200 acre-feet a year on average of return flows. Well, with that, I'm going to hand it over to Dave, and he's going to talk a little bit about projects and management actions and the implementation plan now that I've sort of set the stage for what we're looking at and what we're up against here.
Thanks, Robert. So, as I mentioned earlier, a little bit of this is going to be some review on projects and management actions. Potential projects, this is a list of them that all are going to get discussed to some extent in the groundwater sustainability plan. Where's the Could be.
It's fresh batteries.
Anyway, the CAP project, that's what Robert just modeled, that one, that's happening. You know, it's in final design, the funding's been procured, it's gonna, you know, scheduled to start delivering water in 2027. These next couple, we've sort of rearranged a little bit. The last time I was here, we said, oh, the next most likely project is going to be a seawater barrier project, because as Robert just showed, there's some benefit to the CAP project, but I would describe that as ancillary. It's not designed as a seawater intrusion barrier project. Like he said, it's a water supply project. So we're like, oh, we're probably going to need to move to a seawater barrier project. But as we started looking at it and, you know, did a couple of very preliminary model runs about a seawater barrier project, it became apparent to us that in that area of the aquifer there along the coast, there's really very, very little data. Even with the Sentinel wells, they got some stratigraphy data, you know, so they know where the A, B, and C zone are. But they're only 3-inch wells. They never did pumping tests. They don't know porosity. They don't know, you know, transmissivity or hydraulic conductivity. And these are the parameters that are key to doing, you know, any sort of conceptual design or even model runs for a seawater intrusion barrier project. So first things first, you know, we're calling out a specific project for the Sentinel well expansion. Like Robert mentioned earlier, and we talked about a couple of times at these meetings, they put in that cluster of 3 wells with each one with a discrete well screen interval at increasing depths in the A, B, and C zone. And when they first put them in 2019, none of the 3, you know, had significant amounts of chloride. Since 2020, the C zone in particular has been increasing. The B zone, it's been sort of up and down. But the point is, you know, compared to some of these other coastal basins, Oxnard, Salinas, Mound, you know, where they've had demonstrated seawater intrusion, you know, for decades. Here, we've got a single point in space, you know, where we've seen it, and it's only in the last couple of years. So, you know, after the CAP project, the next one that's going to be prioritized is likely to be this Sentinel well expansion. So we want to put in, you know, at least initially a couple of wells along the coast to better characterize the hydrogeology, you know, in that area. Some between the Sentinel wells and the headquarters well, and some between the Sentinel well up to the northwest toward Montecito. So we're just, you know, presenting that as its own project. Previously, we kind of, you know, said, oh yeah, we'll put this in with the seawater barrier project. But first things first, you know, we need to get some better data. So after that, we'll be talking about a seawater intrusion barrier project. You know, the scope and design of that project will be largely dependent on the data that we collect during the Sentinel well expansion. Another one that we hadn't presented before that's, you know, came up in conversation is municipal well redistribution. Like Robert mentioned, you know, the district's currently only pumping from 3 wells. And the headquarters well is, you know, reasonably close to the coast. If that well were getting sited today, they may not put it there. They might go a little farther inland, or they might go, you know, a little farther down the Rincon Fault. So, you know, some other plans said, well, let's move this pumping from, you know, near the coast to farther inland. And so it's a concept, you know, it's a valid concept that we can discuss, especially because the headquarters well is outfitted to be able to be converted into an ASR well.
What's ASR?
Well, I'm glad you asked. It's the next bullet. Aquifer storage and recovery. That's the 2-way well that Robert was talking about earlier. It's been studied in this basin a couple of times. Like I said, originally the headquarters well was designed to be able to be used as an aquifer storage and recovery well. It's not going to be used as that right now. Right now it's earmarked for the CAP project. But there's been a couple modeling studies. They did some field work 10 years ago or 10 or 12 years ago. So it's been studied. It's not a new idea. Regional water banking agreements, this is what Bob was mentioning. These are early conversations with Casitas and Montecito about possibly with the interties, if they want to come drop some of their water here so they don't lose it. We've got, available storage space that it could go. And usually those things work with they need to leave something back when we pump it back to them. We're early in that, but it is getting discussed. Recharge enhancement, this would be either, like stormwater recharge basins, or it's been brought up that, Franklin and Santa Monica Creeks got lined back in the 70s to mitigate flood risk. And, these days, they're tearing down dams, so it's not crazy talk to talk about taking those linings out so that, when those creeks are flowing, they can recharge the aquifer. There's potential issues that need to be sorted out with the flood control district and stuff, but that's another potential project. So, we'll be talking, at least discussing all of these in the text of the GSP, and I'm going to go through the first few in more detail than the second few, but let's get into it. So the Sentinel well network expansion, other than the CAP project, which is definitely a go, this is the next one that's likely to be a definite go. I wish this light was working, but
It's at the very top. It's like
yeah, this one, right?
it's a little red line.
Yeah.
You have
Oh. Okay. Maybe I just wasn't pushing hard enough. So the Sentinel wells are right here, okay? The district headquarters well is here. This is a water level map from 2020. So you've got this surface depression in the center of the basin that's driving this whole discussion about seawater intrusion. So the groundwater flow direction is basically, from west to east toward this depression, at least in 2020. It varies by year with hydrology. So the idea is to install another couple of Sentinel well clusters, but probably to prioritize this area between the current Sentinel wells and the headquarters well, because that's the closest district well. And then second phase might be running a couple up here on the way to Montecito. So this just shows that, graphically, these sort of pink dots here are just conceptual locations to put in new Sentinel wells. And then when we put these in, might have a little more rigorous data collection program than we had with the initial ones. We definitely want to be able to make them big enough so we can put a pump in there and do aquifer tests, stop and take some undisturbed samples to get porosity. Ultimately, that data can get used to update the model and then, the most important thing is that they can then be sampled. You can put transducers in them to monitor water levels and conductivity, but you sample them quarterly or biannually to get, hard lab data on chlorides. So it will allow us to monitor, the progression, if there is a progression of seawater intrusion in all three zones. And then also, like I said, get that important aquifer parameter data that we'll need to assess, forward movement. Now, I'll take just a moment here to talk about groundwater velocities. We did some quick calculations. You know, there are accepted equations for this, and we did them with a range of, you know, hydraulic conductivity is the thing that we don't know. So there's values for that in the model, but they're based sort of on calibration. They're not really based on the actual data from the aquifer. So we ran them with a variety of hydraulic conductivities, and we got, you know, these are first order estimates of like 75 to 350 feet a year. The distance between the Sentinel wells and the headquarters well is about a mile. So, I mean, based just on that, you know, it could be 10 years, it could be 50 years if conditions don't change for, you know, for water molecules if they're sailing to make it from the Sentinel wells to here. So I just say that to put the timing in context. So, you know, taking 5 years to stop and get this data, you know, it's a reasonable thing to do. It seems unlikely that that front is going to have moved that far in just the next couple of years. So I just wanted to make that point. Groundwater moves at a very, you know, slow velocity. It's dependent on the gradient, you know, like this one. These are 10-foot contours. So, you know, between the Sentinel wells and the headquarters wells, a difference of about 15 feet. So just wanted to make that point about groundwater velocity. And it's unlikely that taking the 5 years to get this good data is going to, you know, have a negative impact on conditions in the basin. Sentinel, you know, on costs and scheduling, right now they're installing a well cluster in El Caro Park. So we have a really good, you know, idea of what that cost is. It's about $750,000 for a cluster of 3 wells. Another 150 or so for design, engineering, permitting, you know, non-drilling costs. The 750 is like drilling costs, and then 150 for engineering and other support. So about $900,000 per, you know, cluster of 3 wells. Like I said, it would probably be prudent to prioritize 1 or 2 in the area between the current Sentinel wells and the headquarters well. Get those in first, get that data first, and then drop back and then maybe go up the coast toward Montecito in a second phase. So, you know, we're talking about putting in at least 1 or 2 toward the headquarters well within the first 5-year Sigma implementation period. Okay, now we'll talk just conceptually about the seawater barrier project. Scott, this is that cartoon that I was kind of talking about. So under, you know, non-pumping conditions, you know, this dashed level is basically water level surface, right? Here's the ocean, here's fresh groundwater in a confined aquifer. This is water flowing from the ocean into the aquifer. So under non-pumping conditions, you got this sort of bubble of fresh water sitting on top, you know, of a wedge of potential ocean water coming in. Again, seawater is denser, so it sinks. You're going to find it at higher concentrations in deeper strata. And you come along here, you put in a pumping well, you know, you're decreasing your water levels, so you increase the possibility for seawater intrusion. And the simple concept of a barrier well is to put in a well between your pumping well and the ocean, and that keeps the intrusion at bay. You know, this isn't a new idea. They've been doing it down Orange County in LA for a number of years. They're doing it up in Salinas right now. It's not simple, but, you know, it's a well-proven, you know, engineering concept, and it is, you know, it's the next most likely project once we do the Sentinel well expansion. So this is again, these are conceptual well locations. You know, we haven't gone out and done site studies or anything like that. But so here's the current Sentinel wells. We're talking about putting in a couple here, new Sentinel wells, and then a couple up the coast. And these big yellow dots are just conceptual injection wells, and they're, you know, we're just, you know, threw them on the map as along a linear front that would keep seawater from intruding. You know, do we need 3? Do we need 8? Don't know. That's why we need to do the Sentinel well network expansion first to get that data. So we're not going to we're not going to present any potential project costs or anything like this because, you know, we just need to get that data first. So the sequencing of a seawater barrier project would be, you know, first things first, I'll say it one more time, we've got to do the Sentinel well expansion first, okay? We do not have adequate data to even do conceptual design, figure out how many wells we might need or the cost. It's just, we're not there yet. Once we do have that data, you know, we'll be able to update the model with the specific aquifer transmissivities that we get from the new wells, porosity, et cetera. And after that, we can start doing some runs, see, well, you know, 3 wells ought to do it, or no, we're going to need 12 wells, you know. I mean, really can't tell right now. I don't think it's going to be 12, but, you know, they're not going to be cheap wells. It's not going to be a cheap project, so we want to, you know, we just want to just, you know, get the data. So after we do the modeling, there will be engineering analysis, feasibility, cost estimate, et cetera, and then some pilot testing. So here I have kept Sentinel well expansion as part of the barrier project sequencing, but you know, we're presenting it as its own project in the text of the plan. This is, I mentioned earlier, municipal pumping distribution. So right now, the 3 wells that the district pumps are this one, Headquarters Well, El Caro Well, and Smiley Well. These other ones, Lyons and High School, are not currently used. Sentinel wells are over here, so there's concern about seawater intrusion here. So ultimately, you know, in long-term planning, there could be conversion of the Headquarters well to an ASR well. It's not that old a well. It was put in about 20 years ago. It's all stainless steel. It should have plenty of life left. So it might eventually, you know, be a management decision to convert that well to ASR and either, you know, and then put in a new well somewhere else, possibly replace one of these ones that aren't currently getting used. But to move, you know, the center of gravity of the pumping inland, you know, farther away from the coast, possibly, you know, behind the Rincon Creek Fault, which provides some protection from seawater intrusion. So that's the idea. It's, yeah.
Did you or Robert indicate that we've just identified one location where we're observing seawater intrusion into the basin?
Yeah, in those Sentinel wells, which are like right here. Yeah, it hasn't been observed in district wells or hasn't really been observed in any private wells. I mean, the district, how many wells do you guys sample? About 30, 25?
Yeah, 30 to 40.
Yeah, they've been collecting samples for the last 25 years. And there's not really been any, you know, clear rise of chlorides in any levels. There are some places where chlorides are already kind of high, like near Arroyo Paradon Creek, and some of them out in Shepherd's Mesa. But nobody's proposing that that's has anything to do with seawater intrusion. It has to do with just, you know, natural variability of groundwater conditions. In the case of Arroyo Paradon, the surface water coming out of there is pretty poor quality, so it's probably has more to do with that. So
where we've currently identified seawater intrusion in the basin is over by the Santa Claus Beach area?
Yep, right.
Yeah,
right about here.
it's right off of Sandpoint Road, right at the entrance of Sandpoint Road.
Okay.
Oh, wait a minute, up here. There we go. Yeah,
Over by the polo field wells.
south of there, yeah.
No, not quite up, not quite up.
Yeah,
up
those
there.
are more
Not
like
that far,
here.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is right at
Right where
at
the
the
bend
Santa
is
Claus
here, yeah.
on-ramp going southbound on the 101.
Okay.
Yes, the new roundabout.
Ah,
Yeah, the new roundabout.
thank you. And I grew up right near the Rincon Anticline or the Rincon Creek Fault over by, closer to Rincon Creek, so I'm familiar with where it is there. I'm trying to understand where it enters the ocean, and I'm seeing there, is that kind of around Linden Avenue, Linden Beach?
Oh, where the
Bob?
creek hits it's just east of the marsh. I mean,
Yeah.
here's
Yeah.
the marsh.
Just east of the mouth of the slough.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yep.
Great, thank you.
Okay, I'm just going to talk very briefly about aquifer storage and recovery. It's, again, it's not a really new concept. It has been studied here in the basin a couple of different times over the last 15 years. You know, when I started in this business in the 90s, I thought it was a pretty new thing and, you know, pretty hip, and it's gotten a lot more acceptable, or accepted, I should say, you know, in the past couple of decades. It's practiced nationwide now, and it's a well-tested technology. So, you know, the idea is when you've got the water, when in times of plenty, you store it in the aquifer just like you would store it in a reservoir. You know, you need to be able to you need to construct a well that can handle two-way flow. You can inject and pump out. It can be operated at various time scales. You know, some people just do it daily, but it can be done, you know, seasonally, where you inject in the winter if you've got it, pull it out in the summer, or it can be operated on a longer term, you know, drought cycle, where you inject it when you've got a couple of years in a row of wet, and then pull it out, you know, during the drought. So as you inject it, you sort of get this, you know, bubble, for lack of a better term, as it starts, you know, moving out from the well. You know, this picture makes it seem like there's a really sharp interface between the injected water and the native water, and that's, you know, that's not the case. There's always sort of a mixing zone. So when you pull it back, you know, depending, at some point when you start pulling it back out, it'll look less like pure injected water and start having some of the water quality of the native water. So, you know, there's a lot of technical details that are involved. Like I said, it's been studied here before. We're going to include it as a potential future project in the plan, especially with the headquarters well, you know, convertible to an ASR well. But I don't think we'll be presenting, you know, detailed costs or number of wells or anything like that. Recharge enhancement, I mentioned it just very briefly. You know, there's inflow, there's outflow. So the inflow on the recharge part it's either stream percolation or percolation of rainfall. So if you've got a water source and you've got land, you can build like a stormwater capture basin to capture that water, let it percolate naturally. You know, it takes land and it takes a water source, but people do it all the time. So it's a potential project that would increase the recharge side of the equation. The other one is mentioned de-lining the creeks. You know, Santa Monica and Franklin Creeks were lined to move that water through a lot faster. It's been proposed, maybe we could take that out. It would allow more percolation of stream water, you know, when the creeks are flowing. There was some preliminary modeling done about 10 years ago that indicated, about 200 acre-feet a year recharge could be, realized with a project like this. That was a modeling study. That was not an engineering analysis where they looked at cost benefit or, you flood $1 million house out and it might, make that whole project look a lot different. So, it's not to say it can't be done. It needs to be studied. As I will talk about in the implementation plan, there will be some sort of, like a, what's the word I'm looking for? Like a ranking study of all these different projects, to look at cost benefit and see what gives you more bang for the buck. Mentioned this, Bob mentioned it with the intertie with Casitas, and there's also, very preliminary discussions with Montecito about possibly, if they need a place to put some water when they, if they don't want to lose it, conceivably they could bring it over here. We could put it in an ASR well or a basin and perk it or get it into the aquifer, and then they leave behind whatever the negotiated percentage is when they make a call for that water later on. Very preliminary conversations at this point, but we want to put everything that could happen, we're going to include in the plan because it makes it usually, it has to be in the plan to be available for funding in the future. So management actions would be, technical assistance for conservation, DWR and regional board, frequently, have programs where they offer, assistance for municipal and agricultural conservation, well metering to get a better handle on exactly what the pumping is in the private agricultural wells. Not saying it's definitely happening, but it's a management action that's going to be discussed. There's definitely going to be some additional monitoring to address data gaps, like we were talking about that one well behind the fault block, behind the Rincon fault, where we said, oh, we need to get some better data on that. That's that 35E1, put a transducer in there and get some continuous data. I'm going back a couple of meetings, but there were 2 areas identified that could not be screened out for potential groundwater dependent ecosystems. So there could be a study there. Again, we'll include, let's see, the Sentinel well expansion, we're calling that more of a project now, not a management action. But, these are the ones that will be included. Again, it's like the projects. If you don't include them, you can't go asking DWR for money down the line. So it's everything that's in the toolbox is going to be included. The short-term and long-term implementation plan is what I'm going to discuss now, and this will be the final chapter in our GSP that will include a ranking study of all the projects that I just talked about. The next 5 years will include and presumably see the complete implementation of the CAP project. The Sentinel network expansion, that's targeted for the next 5 years, so that'll be included. Metering study, more than likely. It's not clear yet how the ongoing GSA funding is going to be accomplished. Those things need to be included. I just mentioned the potential groundwater dependent ecosystems, some data gaps like the 35E1 well, and then there's annual reports that have to be submitted every year. So that's part of the implementation plan. And every one of those annual reports has to have the last section is progress towards sustainability. So DWR wants to see that you're making progress. For the 20-year implementation plan, which is you're supposed to demonstrate sustainability, according to Sigma by 20 years, that would include a seawater intrusion barrier project if needed. We'll see after the Sentinel well expansion. Possibility of new municipal wells or redistribution of pumping. That's not likely to happen in the next 5 years, but it could happen in the next, 10 to 20. And again, annual reports, the district will be churning those out for the entire 20-year Sigma implementation period. That's a requirement. The documents are nearly complete. We're going back and doing a couple of cleanup things on Chapter 3. Chapter 4 is ready. Chapter 5 is in Bob's hands. That's almost ready for public review. Chapter 6, I'm writing. I'm almost finished with it, 6 and 7. So we're expecting the entire plan basically to be ready in September for public input and public review. We'll be making a push for, we need to have written comments, and they'll probably, we'll make it clearer in the outreach program, but you can submit comments through the website. All comments will be responded to and included in an appendix, The final publication for review and presentation to Bob's board is like the second half of October, and it's got to be submitted to DWR by the end of the year. And that is the end of the groundwater sustainability plan road for now until the first implementation period starts on January 1st, 2024, right? There's going to be at least one more meeting of the Groundwater Sustainability Public Advisory Committee. We're going to review the chapters 4 through 7. That's next Tuesday. Those are public meetings if anybody's interested. There'll be discussion of metering, and there's been some discussion already about how to generate revenue for GSA activities, but that's next Tuesday. That's it. Questions? More questions?
I got a question.
Scott?
I saved my questions for now, so I'm going to hit you with them. But with regard to new private wells, who will have the authority for that? Because I would think that has to be part of the plan somehow.
Yeah, we don't know whether there's an emergency ordinance or executive order out there that requires the GSA to verify any new proposed wells are consistent with the GSP. And so we don't know if that's going to turn into statutory legislature or remain in an executive order. And if it does remain in an executive order, then there's always a chance that will be rescinded at some point.
So that's state?
That's the state. The governor issued an executive order, I think it was
2 years ago.
in
during the drought.
1722, I think it was what the executive order.
And then wasn't there some talk of the county not approving
Well permits.
without the approval of the local GSA?
Yes. So that's
Okay.
that's what I'm referring to in the executive order. It required the agency that permits wells to coordinate with the GSP and get that verification letter.
Okay, so that's all evolving.
That's all involving, yes.
Okay, other question on measuring the level of the groundwater basin. So the district is using 9 different well sites. Is that how it's established, when we talk about the level of the groundwater in the basin?
They measure water levels in more than those. They measure water levels in 30 or so. But those 9 that's how we're going to define sustainability in those 9 for water levels.
Okay.
In those 9 wells, in 20 years, as long as we're maintaining water levels above the minimum threshold, you've demonstrated sustainability. But every year they measure water levels in spring and fall in like 30, and like, I showed that water level on map, that's got a lot more than 9 data points in it. So in the annual reports, there'll be spring and fall water level maps, change in storage calculations.
Is it an average of those measurements? Or do they say, okay, groundwater's 50 feet below the surface? Or what?
A bit below the minimum threshold, you mean?
Well, I mean, whatever they're measuring, whatever level that is being used that we want to, right now, come up from.
Right.
What is that level?
Well, it's anything above the minimum threshold, and if you're below the minimum threshold, and we've written it up as in more than 33% of the wells,
Okay.
So that's 3 out of 9. So it doesn't mean that your basin isn't sustainable because one well drops below that, for a year. It's got to be a little more geographically, we've written it up as
So there isn't
a third of the RMS wells.
There isn't one level.
No.
It's okay.
Each one of those 9 representative monitoring wells has a level, right? The minimum
Yeah,
threshold.
you may recall in the sustainable management criteria discussion that we utilized the basin, I believe it was the 2018 levels to establish the minimum threshold. In other words, we didn't want to see any well go below 2018 levels.
Yeah.
So we set the MTs, or minimum thresholds, at those levels. Then we monitor those wells over time, and if they are below that minimum threshold, I think it's for 2 consecutive.
3 consecutive
Three consecutive.
measurements bracketing 2 years. So
Right.
it's got to be, so you've got to be below that minimum threshold level in 3 wells for 2 years.
So a couple questions on the CAP project, and going back to something that Robert said in his presentation about a well being up in the foothills and not being influenced by the CAP project, but also saying that water flows downhill. I would think, just in my layman's understanding, that the higher the level is in the basin as a whole, because of the CAP project actually injecting water in and bringing that level up, there would be less movement from outlying wells to the center of the basin. So, and you're nodding, so that would make sense.
That's a fair observation, yeah.
So in the idea of water being injected through the CAP project, could that water augment the water coming out of private wells, or just reduce the amount of water moving away from those wells towards, let's say, the center of the basin or something? Which of those scenarios is more likely for periphery type wells? And we're over here on the east side, and as our wells dropped during the drought, I kept wondering how much of that level is dropping because we're pulling water out, and how much is that level dropping because that water is moving
Toward the depression.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so does the geology in this basin allow for that to go in the other direction as water is augmented?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
And so I think that is part of the physical explanation for why we see water level benefits at 19F4, at these other wells that are outside the project area. It's not necessarily because injection in the cap wells is actually on a one-for-one basis causing the water levels to just go up there, we could be seeing that water level benefit because we have filled up the depression and the water is no longer moving from the margins of the basin towards the center of the basin as fast as it otherwise would. In other words, it's hanging around longer. But I think it's probably a combination of factors. It probably varies from, location to location. So, discretizing how much of the effect at any given well is due to the change in the gradient versus actual direct water level impact due to injection. Those questions could be answered, but it would take, like dissecting the model and, but I think conceptually what you're saying makes sense and is probably what's happening.
And the other part of that is, when we're thinking about that, it really isn't the elevation of the well head. It's the elevation of the water level in the well that
Precisely. Yes.
Okay. And I think, two other questions. And part of this came out of discussion in our committee. It would make sense to me that it's good to have storable space available in the basin, not knowing that rainfall, we could have a year like we just had, where if the goal is to have the basin too full, whatever that might be, too full, and then you have big rainfall years, that rain water might be lost because it doesn't have a place to go in the basin.
Mm-hmm.
So is that
the goal is not to have it totally full because,
Right.
then you're right. There's a term called rejected recharge. It's
Yeah.
usually for like shallower type aquifers where if they fill up and it rains, it just runs off. It doesn't go into the aquifer after a certain point. So yeah, that happens.
Last question. The CAP project, is that seen as a real plus for our ability to be approved, have our GSP approved, having something like that in it, versus if we didn't have that in it?
I think absolutely, because it increases the effective sustainable yield, by 1,000 acre feet a year, And as Bob pointed out, that doesn't mean, that's an extra 1,000 acre feet for ag, that they're going to be pumping that water, but that means they're not pumping native groundwater. So it's definitely makes the basin more sustainable.
Yeah, and again, just to, hammer the point, I think if I were DWR looking at this, the main threat to sustainability of this basin is the potential for seawater intrusion. So to the extent that any project reduces the potential for seawater intrusion, that's the ball game. So the fact that CAP doesn't reverse how much inflow we're seeing coming across that ocean boundary, but it reduces it by 25%, that's significant.
I have a comment and a question. The comment is that it seems that managing the groundwater basin, you have two conflicting objectives. On the one hand, you want to keep that basin as full as possible to survive extended droughts. But on the flip side, you don't want it totally full because you want to be able to accommodate heavy rainfall years and the influx. So it's tricky. Question is, I was wondering on the injection barrier project, looking at aquifers B and C being pretty heavily negative in terms of elevations, if you brought them up to where you might stop seawater intrusion, would it cause daylighting of fluid up into the basin? I'm just wondering.
You'd have to design it so it wouldn't. You don't want that. But if it's, I mean, those are in the, well, I don't know. Are they in the confined?
Yeah,
zone?
no, that's an astute observation, sir. Because I spent a lot of time talking about in the CAP project, we got to keep water levels below ground surface to be feasible and all that. And then we're saying for to hold seawater back, we need to get water levels at least at the coast above sea level or above ground surface, particularly in the sea zone. So how do we explain that? I think in the simplest terms, it's because for the CAP project, these injection wells are completed in the A, the B, and the C zone, and the degree of confinement between the A zone and the ground surface is probably not extensive. So the potential, so all other things being equal, if you pressurize the aquifer such that the piezometric surface or the head is above ground surface, if that piezometric surface is above ground surface in the shallow aquifer system, the potential for daylighting is much higher than if we're doing an injection barrier at the coast in the C zone, for example, where we're injecting into the zone that's 900, 1,000 feet below ground surface, and it has 800 feet of material. The degree of confinement is much higher. So even though if you go to the injection well and you measured the water level or the head in that injection well or in the aquifer system in the monitoring wells in the seawater barrier area, the piezometric surface or the head is above ground surface and by definition artesian conditions. Because that's occurring in the deep, highly confined zone, the potential for daylighting, out there in the grass or whatever is much, much less than we're concerned might happen with the CAP project. Mm-hmm. So it's a challenge. It's absolutely a challenge. And, the other thing about the seawater barrier project is, it would be located, these wells, as close to the ocean as we can possibly get it. So to the extent that we do have artesian conditions created by the seawater barrier project by design, it'll be more of a localized area where you would see that, as opposed to the CAP project, which is right in the middle of the basin, kind of on the edge of the confined layer and the recharge area, and it's affecting water levels in a much bigger area. So again, the concern, I think, for daylighting is much more acute for the CAP injection wells compared to seawater barrier wells. And just furthermore, I think, when I was showing you the water level hydrographs for the Sentinel well in the A zone and the B zone and the C zone, and based on some of the preliminary modeling that we did do of seawater barrier concepts that Dave mentioned, we probably won't need barrier wells in the A zone. We're probably only, if we do need barrier wells, it'll probably only be in the C and the B zones.
Sort of on that note, just curious more about the flow of the groundwater in the basin and in the different aquifers. And you've educated about the Rincon Fault being this barrier, physical, semi-impermeable barrier to the groundwater. And then talking about the different zones, A, B, and C. Is the A zone confined to itself and the groundwater can only migrate and flow within the A zone, or is it able to migrate? My question is, are there any other boundaries to that free flow of the groundwater outside of the Rincon Fault in our basin?
No, not really. The confining layers that separate the A, B, and C zones is just vertical. So the primary source of recharge to wells in the confined area or in the A zone and the B zone is the thing that Scott that was talking about. You're getting all of your recharge in the unconfined area of the basin, along the margins of the basin. Rainfall, stream flow percolates in those areas and flows in the subsurface laterally towards the confined area.
Yeah, take a look at this well diagram. I mean, I was going to refer you to you can look at the cross sections too, but the screen intervals, which is these areas, those correlate to the A, B, and C zones. Look how relatively thin those are compared to, this section of, 600 or 800 feet of what's essentially clay and silt, fine-grained sediments. So, there may be more vertical flow between B and C than between A and B, but I just wanted to make the point that the actual productive zones, they're reasonably thin compared to the full section of sediments.
Yeah, each one of these producing zones, these coarse grain zones that have been mapped and designated as the A, B, and C zones are relatively thin compared to the overall thickness of the basin. We're talking 100, 150 feet thick at most.
For that reminder, I was thinking of A zone over here, B zone over here, C zone over here.
Yeah,
but
it's vertical. Yeah,
Yeah.
the aerial or like map view segregation of the basin is confined area in the center of the basin where we have these clay layers vertically that confine those zones. So we have a confined area in the central part of the basin. And then we have the recharge area, which is basically everything outside the confined area. And then the Rincon Creek Fault, which separates the basin into these two different storage units, north and south of the fault. Those are really the only aerial-based
like lateral.
segregations in the basin. Yeah, the A, B, and C is just talking about the vertical distinctions and segregations of these zones within the confined area only. In the recharge area, these zones no longer can be correlated between wells, and they start to break down. And the recharge area is conceptualized both in the hydrogeologic conceptual model, but also in the numerical model or the groundwater model, is what we refer to as an undifferentiated stack of sediments. So depending on where you are, you'll have a different sequence of sand, silt, gravel, clay. You won't necessarily have this nice ABC layer, whereas in the confined area, and there's been so much drilling and so many wells in the confined area that we find the A zone at one location, we can with pretty high degree of certainty predict where the A zone will be at another location in the A zone, in the confined area. But again, in the subsurface, they're all connected. They talk to each other. So what goes on in the recharge area affects what goes on in the confined area and vice versa.
Great, thank you. My only other question, in talking about aquifer storage recharge basins, ASR basins, are lakes like Lake Cachuma or Casitas considered an ASR basin? Are they contributing to recharge, or is there percolation? The whole lake isn't lined or compacted.
So it's important to define what a groundwater basin is under Sigma. Under Sigma, it's granular or alluvial deposits, granular deposits confined by bedrock. And so Cachuma is a little different in that it's a river, and so the underlying bedrock is probably pretty shallow, and there may be some, in fact, there is some water loss into the ground migrates under the dam and back into the river. But it's not considered a groundwater basin under Kachuma.
Okay, that makes sense.
Understood.
And
Yeah.
speaking within our district or our basin, we don't have any lakes. Maybe the biggest one I can think of is Yule Lake. And do we consider that as part of the inflow of percolation to our water portfolio?
It's right on the fault, so it would be hard to make a definitive statement about whether that water is making it into
But
the
the
basin.
streams do.
Yeah.
Streams are definitely, in streams, as they cross the recharge zone up, uphill from the confined zone, those are percolating.
Yeah, the streams contribute, I think it's around 20% of the total amount of recharge to the basin. The predominant source of recharge in the basin is just direct infiltration of precipitation. Yep, yep, that's the main source.
Thank you.
It's because of a water forum that was put on in Ventura County, and several agencies participated. And one of the items of rectifying the groundwater situation was desal. That's absent from our list. But what struck me in that forum was that desal isn't necessarily only ocean desal, that there are water sources in Ventura County that have high salinity. And
Brackish. Yeah.
Brackish
brackish,
groundwater.
I guess.
Yeah.
And part of some of their plans is to desal that water and add it to the system. Now, I'm guessing that the Arroyo Paradon is not enough water to bother with, but the Pacific Ocean's pretty big, but it's not something that would be on our list in 25 years or something like that?
Brackish water desal?
We looked at it. I mean, I think our opinion was sort of a losing battle. You're sucking in seawater into the basin so that you can clean it up and then re-inject it to lose it. And it seemed like wasn't a real high benefit to cost ratio.
I understand some of the farmers over there by Arroyo Paradon, they're doing it on their own, right? They got RO units that's basically what they're doing.
Right. And
They're desalinating the brackish groundwater that they have access to.
And on a small scale, they may be cleaning it up and adding to our basin with that.
Yep.
But also on the larger scale, the desal concept of ocean water desal, our sanitation district is right there on the ocean. I mean, I'm just talking, we've got this plan that's going to be looked at every 5 years and is going, right on into 50 years and all of that. It seems like it being right here on the coast at some point in time, that may be part of our plan.
Yeah, and one of the benefits that Ventura County has, they have a brine line that travels from, southern Ventura out through Camarillo and out to the ocean. And so there are impacted basins with brackish water where they can remove the salt and dump it into the brine line. The brine line takes it out to the ocean.
That removes a huge cost.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But Bob, you can answer this. It's my understanding that desal takes 7 times more energy than super purification of sanitation water.
Yeah, so when you're removing salt, obviously it'll take a lot more energy to push that water through the membranes to remove that salt. And so that, I think City of Santa Barbara's cost per acre foot at this point is somewhere around almost $4,000 an acre foot, so quite a bit more expensive.
Yeah, and the Santa Barbara project, the way that they get water from the ocean and the way that they dispose of the brine, they skillfully managed to leverage the permitting that they had from the plant from the early 90s to get those intake and outfall structures permitted for their project. If someone was going to start from scratch right now, the chances of getting an open ocean intake and brine disposal is be probably slim to none. The Coastal Commission really frowns on that. And before they would even consider something like that, you would need to do lots of studies of subsurface intake and disposal. In other words, a bunch of wells on the coast pumping to induce seawater intrusion, basically, in a localized area. And then you got to still figure out what to do with the brine. My sense of it, and this is just my own opinion, is it's incredibly expensive. It has a lot of logistical and technical and permitting hurdles. And at least right now, I think that this basin has several that Dave just talked about, more feasible, less costly options that could and should be explored. Conceptually, though, if it turns out that those projects are either infeasible or they don't do the job, they don't get us where we need to be, some sort of desal project might still be on the table, but again, it's going to be like orders of magnitudes more costly to both construct and operate than some of these other much less costly options.
I was just along those lines. I was just wondering, if you don't mention it in the initial report, do you lose the ability to pursue that option?
I kept saying that, but it's, this is a 20-year process, so.
Yeah. We have opportunities to update the report every 5 years.
Yeah, every 5 years.
Yeah, and you're not limited to that. If something happens, you can update it tomorrow if you want, So, no, I kept saying it's got to be in the plan to be considered for funding, but that's an ongoing thing. You can always change your plan.
Yeah, I only mention that because technology changes, and 50
Right.
years is a long time
Yeah.
in that point of view. I mean, we could have fusion power at that point
Sure.
with dirt cheap power. I mean, who
Yeah.
knows?
Yep. Absolutely. Well, I mean, the time to look at it again, I think, would be in another 5 years after this 5-year implementation plan has been implemented and we have a better handle on things. I'm cautiously optimistic that a combination of pumping redistribution, basically trying to back off on headquarters as much as possible, or maybe even turning that into an ASR well, and then recovering the cap water with pumping El Caro and Smiley harder, is going to really have a significant benefit on water levels at the coast, such that if a barrier project is still required, the magnitude of that project, the problem that barrier project is going to need to solve is going to be a much smaller problem than we would otherwise be looking at. So I think, the eventual solution is going to be probably a combination of all of these things. Mm-hmm. And, some of these things can be done almost at no cost. There's almost no cost associated with pumping headquarters less and El Caro more, right?
Yeah, and the nice thing about this 20-year implementation is we'll have the CAP project operating, and we can turn the knobs and see what happens when we turn the knobs, and that's going to inform us on the path forward. And so it's nice that we have this, buffer between now and compliance date. That's right.
Right, and just kind of adding on to what was said earlier, the brine of desal is way heavier than the brine coming out of a super purification, so that already causes environmental issues if you don't properly, like Santa Barbara is mixing their sewer fallout with their brine in order to pass the Coastal Commission. So, yeah.
Good meeting.
All right.
All right, thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Hopefully never.
No, you're going to be